Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming along. My day job is public policy editor of The Economist, but like you tonight, I'm here to listen and learn from a very fascinating debate, which I'm sure you'll agree. A natural gas revolution, hot air, or a dose of sanity? Or possibly a bit of both. The timing could not be better. I think we know that when we've seen the Prime Minister dragged back to explain his declarations on energy, that we know that we're in the right ballpark in terms of a subject that is, I think, coming up the political agenda very fast indeed. And gas is at the centre of this in so many ways. Is it the energy source of the future? It's relatively clean, it has low emissions compared to coal, so we would of course be doing our bit for the planet if we list in the direction of the age of gas. There's plenty of it around in the ground, meaning that a reasonable portion of our energy at least would be generated from secure sources, and that in a world of slings and arrows of often unstable times would of course be very reassuring. But others would argue to the contrary. It is a short-term fix. The price of gas does seem set to rise. It has already risen quite steeply, and it's different in different parts of the world and in different political jurisdictions. And what about climate change? If we're serious about that, should we not be putting our attention elsewhere and developing the UK's vast potential for wind, wave, and solar power? So there are powerful arguments on all sides of this debate. Unfortunately, we have some powerfully argumentative people here to put them to us, and of course, lots of time for engagement and questions as well. We will get underway now. I will just tell you briefly how it will work. 4 parts. Geology and availability of gas is our first topic. We'll then move on to the environment, then to the geopolitical situation and security questions that arise from that. And we will finish with a conversation on the impacts of this development on UK policy, followed again by some questions. So if your favourite bit hasn't come yet, it is coming down the line very shortly. But first of all, I would like to introduce our first speaker tonight. That's Wim Thomas, who's Chief Energy Advisor at Shell and Head of the Energy Analysis Team at Shell's Global Scenario. Wim is going to speak for 10 minutes. Wim, please take the chair.
Thank you. Well, it will be quite a challenge to do it in 10 minutes. So let me, but you were a good timekeeper there, so that's excellent. So actually, let me just welcome all, and then go straight away to my key slide, and that is the key messages. And then all other slides afterwards are really the bonuses. Just let me say a few of the key messages. I mean, a lot of people think that you still have to wait for new breakthrough technology, and I don't think that's the case. We have the existing technologies, but they have to break through. And that doesn't come by itself. And unconventional gas in America was a big surprise to everyone, say, in the last decade. But the first pioneers were already out there trying to develop the technology in the 80s. So it takes a few decades, about 3 decades, for new technology to really come through. And that's a very normal time span in the energy industry to actually have new technologies coming on stream to about 1% market share when it actually becomes competitive with existing incumbents. So bear it in mind, 3 decades before it becomes competitive, another 3 decades before it actually reaches a natural market share. So it's a really intergenerational game. Then the other aspect is something about efficiency. A lot of policy is based on efficiency, that we're going to improve. So the UK has something built in around 15% over the next 25 years. But efficiency doesn't come by itself. It has its own dilemmas, policy dilemmas, because, you know, who's going to pay for it? Because if an end consumer not have the expectation that end consumer prices will continuously rise, why would he invest now, upfront, a lot of money to invest in efficiency? Well, governments normally like to say that energy should be more affordable and come cheaper every day. And here's kind of a dichotomy to breach. Another critical technology which we have to really come to grips with soon is carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, really to decarbonize the power system. I'm afraid if you want a lower carbon system, you can't do without a technological fix called carbon capture and sequestration. Then my second key point is actually that gas will be a backbone of sustainable energy systems of the future. Why do I say that? Well, gas is abundant and affordable, etc. But if you want to have more and more renewables, intermittent renewables in your system, you need a kind of backbone, and flexible backup source which can actually take up that flexibility very cost efficiently. Now, we have done a lot of scenario exercises, and every time, right, you see that actually gas is a very good cost-effective way to actually deal with the intermittency. But also we see some kind of natural saturation points in certain sectors of renewables. So when people say 100% renewables for everything is possible, I doubt it, and certainly not in the next 20 years. So gas will be really important in the future. And then I think the third main point is actually that is urgent policy action required. People think they have time because 2050 is a long way, 80% then reduction seems to be still doable. But there's a kind of momentum you have to build up now. And we see actually a lack of policy development, certainly in a meaningful CO2 price, because that's the best way of actually steering consumers' behavior in doing more energy efficient things, or actually pay for new low carbon technologies like CCS. And also something what is quite often forgotten is market structures. You hear a lot of debate about the electricity market, and we want to have mandated renewables in because it's too costly to do the free market way. So you get that, and then you say, oh, we have intermittency, how to solve that? Oh, we need capacity payments for generators to have capacity standby. That's great. So the generators get a kind of non-market-based compensations, you could argue. But that really pushes the flexibility requirement down the supply chains to the volume providers, the gas providers, in this case of coal providers. Coal is easy, you have a heap and you have a bulk carrier. But gas comes long distances in gas pipelines over LNGs. And when there is no security of demand, because you have no clue how much you're going to sell, what the price is going to be, why should Russia develop a field 10,000 kilometers away from us while he doesn't have a long-term contract to finance it? And that is another security supply element. So I would say is, yes, you need market reform, but also the commercial aspects of market reform needs to be taken much more in consideration in an integrated way between electricity and gas, etc., and incumbents. And then my last point is really that the key uncertainties are there. And I mean, unconventional gas is a very good example, right? Will it really be replicable elsewhere in the world? Is the success of North America, is that going to happen in China and South America, and maybe in more modest form here? That is not very certain. Look at the policy debate, or say public debate about fracking. People don't really sure, right? And why should we do that? But if unconventional gas is successful, it really doubles the previous thought resource base of gas. And then it really makes it a real game changer. You can really go for different type of energy systems in a sense that you can, early gains, replace coal by gas. But as you build a big infrastructure system on gas, also you start opening up options for the future. I would call it, say, you have room to maneuver in 2020s, 2030s, because you have a gas infrastructure which is also easily, as little extra cost, they make suitable for hydrogen gas or liquid hydrogen. So actually you may count you're lucky because you have an infrastructure you can piggyback on. If you do another route, then you don't have that infrastructure, and then it becomes very expensive to introduce hydrogen. Why do I mention hydrogen? Because renewables, yes, it's a good idea to decarbonize, but it needs storage. It needs some way of storing these electrons in a useful form. And also it needs a medium to actually be useful in other sectors than electricity, like, for instance, transportation. So maybe in 10 20 years' time, when the hydrogen technology has really evolved very cost-effectively, and you have liquid hydrogen you can transport in tankers, it really becomes complementary of such gas system. And it gives you much more flexibility in the future. Then there are a few key uncertainties as well, and I would just say China. Most people think, well, China's far away, what does it do with us, our gas position? Well, China's decision on policy on the energy mix is very determining how much gas will be available in the rest of the world. If China feels comfortable, say, 4 times or 5 times their present gas consumption by 2030, then the market will be as big as the EU's market as today. And 600 BCM is a lot of gas coming from the market. Yes, they will have some domestic supply, but the more their own unconventional gas becomes successful in China, the more infrastructure they're going to build, so the more gas penetration you have in China, so the more comfortable they are to import a lot of gas via LNG. And guess what? Who competes against that? It's the EU foremost.
Have you got about a minute?
And I'm almost finished. And the last point I want to make is acceptability. Really, we talk about all these new technologies, but it's very much new technologies are hard to have accepted by the public. If it's unconventional gas, it's the fracking debate. If it's carbon capture storage, it's yes, great, but not under my house. Although people are very happy with producing gas under their house for many years, but they're not sure about the CO2 position. So social acceptability is a real issue which you have to deal with. And as a Shell, right, we are more and more now convinced that we have to engage communities, for instance, very upfront before to make it acceptable. And maybe I should stop here then, if you want to be in time.
That would be very noble of you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I have a natural agitation of a radio presenter. I think every 30 seconds is a crime against humanity, but it allows us to have a bit more discussion later. But we're going to have a brief discussion now about some of the subjects that are arising from that very interesting presentation. Do we have some questions? Anybody like to get us going with questions? And could you, of course, please identify yourself when you ask your question?
Good evening. My name is Jean-Marie Bourder, and I'm from Paris, France, as you may understand from my accent. I've known Wim for a number of years, and I'm very happy just to make a first comment, which is a very good, I think, summary of what is known and what is also unknown. And I think that there are at least 2 points which are really unknown. The first one is, I would say, the availability of carbon capture and sequestration. And you put it clearly, but I just want to insist. Another point which seems to me very important is whether or not shale gas will appear in other regions of the world. I know that Shell has bet on the shale gas in China, but I think in China there are enormous problems. There are problems of access, there are problems of water, there are problems of geology because the shale gas is...
Let's stop it there because you've actually put two very nice pointed questions and one view of your own. So if you don't mind, I would just like to take an answer to those.
Yeah, so let me pick up the point of how certain is this unconventional gas revolutions elsewhere in the world in North America. North America seems to be on the road, but still people have to realize that the success are what are called sweet spots, geological sweet spots. There's a big area, but by random drilling over all these 30 years, they found certain areas where actually it is really profitable to do it. But unconventional gas wells are not so prolific as normal gas wells, so you have to drill an awful lot of them, and you have to do much more technology to that. But it seems that North America has cracked it, and people are very confident that certainly North America in the gas supply-demand is more or less self-balancing or even can start exporting LNG. The second point is how successful is unconventional gas in the rest of the world? And I would say that's anyone's guess, maybe geologically, but still a lot of wells have to be drilled. People have to have confidence that actually they can find sweet spots. There's a lot of societal debate still. And therefore, our new scenarios, which we're going to publish in beginning next year, one of the critical uncertainties, as we call in these scenarios, is that gas there or isn't that gas there? But really, because that's almost bipolar, if it's there, you have an enormous opportunity to change your energy system, but if it's there, it will be very regional. It's a key uncertainty still.
Any more questions out there? Oh yes, quite a lot of hands. So I'll take a couple together. I'd like to take gentleman in the second row and the lady with the yellow jacket. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Paul Eakins from University College London, Institute for Sustainable Resources. Thank you for your talk. Also, UK Energy Research Centre. Two very quick questions based on statements that were made. The first is by the chair that gas was a relatively low option compared with coal. Well, that of course is true in those countries where it would substitute for coal, but the UK is not one of those. And it is often presented as a substitute for coal in the UK, but we won't have coal in the UK to any extent beyond 2020. And the second, which you said, Wim, which is that it will deal with intermittency, it will indeed and will be crucial to deal with intermittency, but only at very low levels of use. And at the moment, the market would not subsidise, or the market would not bear investment in gas-fired power stations in that very low level of use. So my questions to you are, is the extensive use of unabated gas compatible with the UK's carbon reduction targets in 2050? And if not, as I suspect, should we wait for any new dash for gas until the technical and commercial feasibility of gas CCS has been proved?
Hold that thought just a second while we take the lady's question in the 5th row in the yellow jacket. Thank you. Just pass it along as quickly as you can. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Charlotte Morton from the Anaerobic Digestion and Biogas Association, which potentially reveals my question. It was a very interesting presentation, and I agree with a lot of the issues. I'm just surprised that in talking about gas, there has been no mention of renewable gas, which therefore helps address the CO2 issues. Biogas can generate about 10% of the UK's domestic gas demand, so why wouldn't we be looking at it? And it can be scaled up very fast and very cheaply.
Do you have those in your mind?
Yep.
Two parts and then the second question.
So I agree with that. Also, the Netherlands are looking at biogas. We have a lot of animals, waste, etc. we can use. It is estimated it can be 8% of the total gas demand in certain sectors. So it's significant, and it's being developed. And actually, you can see it's actually being developed not because of government policy, but because the farmers and the greenhouse growers actually see it as a good, cost-effective way to reduce the energy bill. So it's going on. Another element actually in this greenhouse gas business and the agriculture is geothermal warmth, right? Where they actually directly take it from the ground or actually use solar boilers. So these integrated loop systems in certain areas are really taking off. And then I come back to Paul's point as yes, biogas is very important, or commercial biomass if it's in our terms. We assume that there will be quite a significant amount of biogas available which goes into gas-fired power stations. And also in our outlook we assume that CCS is going to be developed on all new power stations post-2020 in Europe, obviously, otherwise you not go there. Now, having said that, I mean, say the early gains, say with replacing a little bit of coal left in the UK, plus the downturn in economic activity, plus the efficiency drive, which is supposed to happen, probably the UK could have something like, what's it, 15 to 20% carbon reduction compared to 1990 in 2020. But thereafter it becomes very difficult. And then it becomes, yeah, what kind of policy do you take? If it is unabated, then you will get stuck to that and you can't go any further. So you must have CCS, and that's what we assume in our modeling. But then we still get stuck around 45, at best 45% by 2050. And if it's a kind of business as usual scenario, so you don't have much policy support for CCS, you probably will stick to about, you go back up to only 15% abatement. So yes, gas without CCS in the long term is not the solution for a lower carbon system. It has to come combined. And that's why our company is actually willing to invest a lot in that technology and demonstrate it can be done commercially and cost effectively.
Thank you very much. Ben. As a particularly, like, did you want to continue?
I
think if you feel that you've covered it, but if there's anything else you want to say very briefly, we will just.
No, I think I'm.
Yes,
I'm
fine. Well, in that case, you are retired.
Oh, thank you.
No, as we've got going, thank you. I was sort of puzzling about the way to hit your emissions target being possibly to stay in recession forever, but maybe let's not put that one to the politicians. But we're moving into a key battleground now, which is the environment. It's already come up, and the question of whether gas will warm us up or help us cool down, and particularly whether the gasification of electricity is part of the solution or indeed part of the problem for greenhouse emissions. Joining us now, Professor Mike Stevenson, who is Head of Science and Energy at the British Geological Survey. And Mike, your 10 minutes begins now.
Thank you very much. As you might expect, I'm going to give you a geological perspective on this, and I will follow in with some of the things that Wim said about CCS. I've got a lot to say, so I'll try and say it without confusing you. This photograph here, you're probably thinking, why have I shown you a picture of a sort of suburban street? It happens to be in Blackpool, which is quite interesting for this discussion, because what it shows is a big crack that goes just underneath my name there. And that crack was very famous in Blackpool for a short time because it purportedly appeared after an earthquake which was related to fracking rather nearby. That's fracking for shale gas, hydraulic fracturing. And people said that the crack had appeared in the bridge, and people also said that the motorbikes had fallen over and that traffic lights stopped working and things like that. And a lot of people said, yes, the crack appeared and it was caused by the fracking. Now, the BGS detected this earthquake, and our view was there's no way that the energy of the earthquake could have caused that crack. And in fact, if you read the article which was attached to this photograph, if you got right down to the bottom, it said, an old Blackpool man said, in fact, that crack has been there since 1972. So, but this characterizes the argument of shale gas, that there's an awful lot of stuff going on which you can't tell is true or false. And it's rather got worse, unfortunately. This is again Blackpool. And Blackpool, and there are people saying on websites that Blackpool, the coast of Blackpool is at risk of sinking below sea level, and our sea defences will have to be rebuilt. Essentially, there is no foundation whatsoever to this. It simply won't happen. It's ridiculous. And unfortunately, this sort of debate is getting wider and wider, and the public are getting fired up with things which are not true, which are scientifically without foundation. So this is going to be a little bit of the spirit of my talk, which is the importance of a proper debate, a reasoned and a mature debate, so that we can make good policy, so that we can make good decisions, because at the moment, I don't think we can. So to a bit of science, I'm sorry to show you a graph so early, but this is a famous graph from Pakala and Sokolow's science paper from 2004. Many of you will have seen this. It's a very clever paper. Some people don't like it now, but at the time it was very good, because what they did was they took the business as usual, which is the ruinous high CO2 emissions rate, which might end us up with a very high temperature rise, and they also drew a graph of the 500 parts per million stabilization level. So in other words, a level of how emissions might increase in the future and how they might be stabilized to develop only a 500 parts per million, which would be safe. And then they divided that triangle up, which they called the stabilization triangle, into a series of wedges, which they called stabilization wedges. And these wedges are a bit like a scientific unit of climate abatement, if you like. And what you would do is you take one off, and if you do that, then your problem gets less. If you take two off, then you're getting nearer to your ideal level. So what is a wedge? Well, a wedge would be doubling global nuclear power. A wedge would be converting 2 billion cars from 30 miles per gallon to 60 miles per gallon. So 2 billion smart cars instead of 2 billion Lamborghinis. Another one is CCS on 800 power stations. And another one is gas. And you've got to give them credit for this, because they recognized the value of gas in 2004. They said, if you replace a substantial number of coal power stations with gas power stations, in fact, 1,500 gigawatts worth of 50% efficient coal power stations, you will get a wedge. So, also in 2004, along came shale gas in the United States. And this picture from Nature nicely shows it. You can see about 2004, 2005, that's when fracking really took off, and horizontal drilling. And look where shale gas might be in the future. In 2035, it might be producing half of America's domestic gas. An extraordinary projection. What does the industry think about this? Well, this nice appearance of shale gas, the tantalizing possibility of a wedge being offered by it. Well, this is from Malcolm Briddard at Shell, who I spoke alongside at a Royal Society talk a couple of months ago, who said, well, displacing coal-fired power and natural gas is the fastest and cheapest way to reduce CO2 in the global power sector. He didn't really go into whether it was with CCS or not. He didn't go into whether it was a bridge to renewables or a backbone, as Wim said. So in other words, we take shale gas for a while, and then when renewables are up to power, then we dump the shale gas. But it wasn't quite clear. So it's not quite clear, where we are on that. Of course, carbon capture and storage is incredibly important because without it, it's going to be very difficult to use fossil fuels at all. So let's look at some figures. Now, lamentably, there are very few figures about whether shale gas or natural gas is truly more green than other kinds of gas or other kinds of energy. The modeling and the work, the studies haven't been done in sufficient detail. There is something that was published by the European Commission about a month ago, which was about shale gas in relation to other energy types. And what they said was in Poland, Poland is extremely dependent for its electricity on coal. Something like 90% of its electricity is generated from coal. If Poland converted overnight to shale gas power stations, which you probably would like to do, it would cut its emissions by 41 to 49%, which is a very large cut. So Poland would immediately become a lot greener. But what about the world? Well, essentially, if we take the high gas scenario of the IEA from the golden rules for a golden age of gas, it doesn't add up, because they say that if you did the high gas use scenario, you'd get 3.5 degrees C% warming, which is highly dangerous. But of course, gas could be part of a wedge. It doesn't have to be a series of wedges. It could be one wedge. But there is a problem, and this is where I'm going to make my pitch to you. There's a real problem with these wedges. I said that there are several wedges that have been described. One, shale gas. Two, nuclear, double global nuclear power. 3, 800 CCS operations on 800 power stations. Unfortunately, the public won't have it, because all those three things, nuclear, shale gas, and CCS, all of them have the same problem, the same lack of belief amongst the public, and that might feed through to policymakers and investors as well. They worry about it. The earth is scary. People are frightened of earthquakes. Look at this. A Somerset expert reckons that if you do shale gas in the Mendips, it'll turn into a volcano. And people believe it. People believe it. And this is the quality of the debate that's out there. I'm not saying that shale gas is the answer. I'm not saying that CCS is. I'm not saying that double global nuclear power either is. But it's a problem, because if you want to do these things, they're all geological. And the public, have many, many questions about the feasibility and the safety of it. So what am I arguing for?
You're arguing it in 1 minute.
Yes, naively, I am arguing that science needs to take a stronger role in this, particularly independent science, to assess the risk and to do it publicly and transparently and openly, and to talk about what's low risk, things we don't have to worry about, like volcanoes and Blackpool disappearing under the Irish Sea. High-risk things, and there are high-risk things. There are things that we should worry about, like methane getting into water supplies, for example. These are things we should think about. But the trouble is, the debate is we're veering over to these ridiculous things, and we get distracted, and what matters is the difference between these two things. If we did that, we might get a better quality debate. We might actually get better policy as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. We do have your number when there is a volcano in the Mendips, and we'll all be on the line. Let's have some questions. Do we have some questions here? I've got a lady at the front already keen to get in. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Mike. Jenny Banks from WWF UK. I was actually going to ask a question quite similar to Professor Eakin's point about not building any more coal, but in light of the fact that's already been asked, just a point really about global fossil fuel reserves. If you look at global conventional known reserves, about 80% of them can't actually be effectively burnt or used if we want to stay within 2 degrees of warming. And that's without looking at unconventionals. And then if you look at the US, the claim is that emissions have fallen because of shale gas. And that might be the case, but actually the coal production is the same, it's just going elsewhere. So isn't this actually about keeping the stuff in the ground?
Do you take that one first?
Keeping the stuff in the ground. Well, I think all I'm saying is that, I'm not advocating any of these things. I'm simply saying that if you want to do them, you're going to have to communicate the science better and the risks, to the public better. Otherwise, we're not going to have these wedges. I'm not advocating shale gas or nuclear or anything else. I'm a public servant, so I don't do that sort of thing. I'm simply here to explain what I think is the issue, and the main issue is if you want to have, fossil fuels or nuclear, or shale gas, well, you're going to have to be able to address these issues. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
But it does sound odd for you to say, though you're of course a public servant, that if you want any of them, I mean, you must have a view on some sort of preference or some sort of risk that attaches to one and not to another.
Yeah, I mean, there are, as I said, there are risks, for example, to do with earthquakes in fracking, in shale gas. And, and there is science that we can do to mitigate those risks. There's science that we can do to develop a procedure whereby a company that might frack can be slowed down. There could be a traffic light system whereby if they get to an earthquake of a certain size, they can be told to stop fracking. That's the appliance of science, if you like, to use a term, it's an advertising term, that shows how you can do this. But you have to do the work, in other words, in order to distinguish low risk from high risk.
Yeah. Anyway, let's take some more questions. We've got one over here and the gentleman in the blue jumper. I'll try and take this gentleman at the front next. So we might take these two together if you do.
Hello, I'm Robert Page. I'm studying geology at Imperial. And possibly if people like the WWF, Greenpeace, the BBC and The Guardian didn't fill the public's imagination with such scaremongering, there might be a chance for the proper science to have an independent look and actually, possibly if we stop bashing the energy companies the whole time, it might be discovered that the wind farms they dream of don't actually solve any energy problems and possibly don't help our CO2 either. So you obsess with bringing down CO2, but maybe the way to do that is through gas. And then we both have an energy supply which we can rely on, and we help the environment.
That's a BBC told. And yes, sir, at the front.
Thank you. Tony Curzon-Price from Open Democracy and Intelligence Squared. I'm interested to know, Mike, whether you think that is there a science to the perception of risk? I'm quite struck by the fact that in the US, somehow or other, it seems as if these perceptions of risk have gone a different way. Might that be linked to different interests that people have? I mean, after all, in the US, if you own a piece of land, then you own the geology underneath it. Yeah. Does the perception of risk depend on our institutions in that sort of way?
Yeah, of course, and you hit on it quite rightly that in the United States, if you have shale gas under your farm or your house, then you stand to gain from it directly. In Britain, you don't. So that changes the argument quite a bit. And there is an extremely well-developed science of risk, and you can be sure that we're working on this. And British regulators take on the science of risk, very fully and very rigorously. But we've seen this already. We know that we have amongst the best and tightest regulations for offshore gas, offshore oil and gas in the world. And generally, the North Sea has been extremely successful in doing that, in regulating properly and making sure it's safe, with a few unfortunate, exceptions. But the people of Blackpool don't take that. They don't want that. And again, I don't want to be seen as somebody who's pushing fossil fuels at all. I'm saying that, if you want to have them, then the science has to be properly communicated. And just going to the gentleman's comment, I don't agree with what you're saying about Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund, because these are all people who contribute to the debate and who make us think, beyond, if we are a fossil fuel company, whatever, you think beyond that. And it's important to have all those stakeholders in the argument and in the discussion. So, and they often put over the science very well. I mean, occasionally, it might be overwrought, but this stuff about, Mendip's volcanoes isn't coming from World Wildlife Fund or Greenpeace. Yeah, well, yeah. Okay.
Well, I think that your point is made, sir. So shall we move on to the next part? Thank you very much, Mike. You're free to go. Of course, all of this depends on and takes place in the context of the geopolitical situation and the question of whether energy independence will give us greater security, and also what that sort of security would look like. And as I was a correspondent in Moscow in the early to mid-90s, this was a period in which it was seen as a sort of no-brainer that this was the way things were going to go, followed by a period of perhaps alarm that this was not going to be the case. And I think that we're therefore very good time to hear from our next speaker, which is Dr. Shamil Yenikeyev, who is Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. And his forthcoming book is The Battle for Russian Oil, Corporations, Regions and the State. You have 10 minutes, Shamil, to sort all that out.
Yes, it's a fascinating story, I think, geopolitics, because it's often misunderstood. That's why it's even more fascinating for people. I think that I'll start first by talking about the early 2000s, when we were in a situation of high oil prices and long-term contracts between Gazprom and its customers in Europe, and long-term contracts which were linked to oil prices. And at the time, Europe was, I think, a little bit concerned that it needs to rely on Russia to balance its energy demand, and there was a drive at the European Union level for diversification of supply. And talks about new supply sources, particularly from the Caspian and Central Asia. How does Russia use its position at that particular time? The position of high oil prices, the position of really great influence in terms of gas supplies. So first, it offers sweet deals on gas in exchange for control over transit pipelines in Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, and also for some downstream assets or to countries which appear to be friendlier than the others. Also, it uses its control over transit routes from Central Asia to make market access hard for Central Asian producers. At the same time, it starts promoting expensive transit avoidance pipelines, having failed to somewhat reach a mutually acceptable agreement with the transit countries. It started building expensive pipelines which bypass those transit countries. Nord Stream gas through that pipeline is already running, and South Stream to avoid transit through those countries. So what happens subsequently is that, obviously, as you all know, the shale gas revolution in the United States, great excitement about the new gas abundance, and also the result of change of export markets for liquefied natural gas, which was supposed to go to the United States and now is going to Europe. And also this affects the traditional price formula that Gazprom was using in its deals with Europe. And there is a talk about delinking gas prices from oil prices. And buyers seeks price renegotiation, and Gazprom starts losing its market share in Europe because of these new sources of gas. At the same time, one interesting development of this period is that Russia also China ends Russia's monopoly in Central Asia by constructing Turkmenistan pipeline from Turkmenistan via Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to China, which is down there. And at the same time, Gazprom comes under increased domestic pressure from politically connected, independent gas producers to allow access to its export monopoly, and also to reconsider the price system that Gazprom is using in its deals with Europe. One interesting aspect of this all is the cheap and plentiful gas in the United States, and how it's going to play or be played by both in the United States, both domestically but also internationally. If the gas is used domestically, it could potentially hurt European manufacturing and chemical industries, because of the United States will have competitive advantage. It could also displace oil, so North American oil could start flowing to international markets and become more volumes will be available. And as a result, we may see a massive reduction of US dependence on the Middle East. And the question will be whether the United States will disengage militarily and then diplomatically from that region and agree to be replaced with China. China, as you can see from this slide, is a premium market for LNG, which is no longer needed in the United States. China's role in Central Asia has also increased because of pipeline projects, and also because Russia is a declining power there. And in a way, China is becoming a very important player in terms of creating a new energy Silk Route from Iran to the Far East, and potentially promoting a greater stability in the region.
You've got about a minute.
Okay. But what will Russia will do? What Russia is likely to do in this situation? Russia is likely to choose gas volumes over prices, because Gazprom at the moment is under a lot of pressure from independent gas producers whose gas production is actually lower domestically. It doesn't cost them as much to produce gas, but also because tax contribution of Russian gas sector is only 3 to 5% when it comes to the Russian budget. What it means that low gas prices will change the EU energy mix in favor of gas. It will promote economic recovery in Europe and demand as well. But at the same time, it will undermine renewables and LNG. At the same time, another interesting aspect about those transit avoidance pipelines, which I mentioned earlier, is that Russia-backed pipelines, Nord Stream and South Stream, could potentially transport newly increased Russian volumes. They now make sense. That now makes sense, so those pipelines will be used for that purpose. And the final slide and some final points.
One final point. The rest you can put in the questions.
Okay. Does gas help or hinder making the world a safer place? Obviously, the increased availability of supplies and the increased diversity of sources is a very important factor. And because gas producers are becoming more responsible, being more responsible by this new competition. And producer-consumer relations as a result and mutual dependence will create greater stability. At the same time, some transnational pipelines, such as Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India pipeline, could promote as well integration and stability in those regions. But one final point is that the battles will continue, but there will be battles based around markets, routes, regulation, technology, competitive advantage and prices, and environment. And domestic politics will play the key role in that, particularly in the United States and Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shamil's minute is about as long as a St. Petersburg night in the summer. But we have one hand up at the front here. And I think, yes, I might take a few questions together, but we could take the lady at the front first, and then this gentleman here, and I can see you all as well.
Hi, I'm Katinka Barish from the Center for European Reform. I'm going to give you another 2 minutes on your last point, whether unconventional gas will have a stabilizing or destabilizing impact on the international political environment. On the one hand, you could, of course, argue that if a country such as Poland has, or even Ukraine, has significant unconventional gas finds, Russia will no longer be able to play shenanigans with its energy policy in its neighborhood. So the European scene looks more stable. On the other hand, I'm wondering if nations feel independent, will they start making stupid mistakes? Will they especially smaller countries, will they start behaving in a way that is actually destabilizing? And you could even draw that point to China. Isn't a bit of energy interdependence in the world quite a good thing? Because countries need to be nice to each other if they depend on each other.
Very nice question, thank you. Can I just have one behind there, please? The gentleman, second row.
Alex Ferguson from the CBI. I'm interested to hear what you think, or how likely some global price convergence is over the medium term in the gas markets, and also how do you think US domestic politics will affect the ability to export LNG from the US?
Sorry, what was the part of your first question? Sorry, I didn't
do you think, will there be are we moving towards a global gas price convergence? And if so, to what extent?
Yes, please take those two first. Be reasonably concise if you could.
Yeah, the first, the argument that I think, taking on Katinska's last point about when countries become independent, I think this is something that Russian politicians have always been complaining about, saying that, oh, this is the old Warsaw Bloc mentality. Those people hate us, and they're actually creating more problems in a relationship with Europe because they became independent. And they're trying to play their own political games and game in international relations. I think that a lot of that will depend on whether there will be actually shale gas development in the foreseeable future in those countries that you mentioned. Because I think that Russians really have the capacity to act quite quickly. And as I said earlier, there is a lot of pressure now, particularly from companies such as Novatek, but also from the Russian oil companies, particularly Rosneft, which is moving into gas business very actively, and could potentially displace Gazprom to a certain degree within Russia, also externally. So I don't know. I think that it's often difficult to make predictions. Your question, is it related to 10 years? 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. When we look at this, another important aspect to remember about all these forecasts, what we're talking about, if you look at the latest, they're talking about 2035, 2040. So we're looking about, 20, 30 years ahead. Look at what we're now in year 1920, 20, 30 years ahead. What has happened in the world? So I think this is an important point, that the world is changing at a very fast pace, and I think that a lot of this forecasts and predictions are just a guide for us to base our decisions. Used to base our decisions on.
Could you just move through so you get to the end of the
the next
question?
point. The next point is I'm basically saying that I think it's unlikely that they will play the destabilizing role, simply because I think it will take them quite a while to actually reach that competitive advantage level. Okay. In terms of the gas prices and also U.S. decisions in America, I think it will be. In terms of your last point, your second question, I think it's the US will probably use both gas domestically but also export it. So I think there will be a decision reached which will satisfy all the interested parties in the United States. When it comes to global prices, I'm not going to answer this question. What I suggest you do is that on the 1st of November, buy a book which is edited by Jonathan Stone, which is dealing with this very issue, the book is about global gas prices. Okay, it looks at different markets.
Okay, well, you've been told to buy a book. That's always a good time to move on. I'd like to just take one more brief question at the back there, and also one brief answer.
Alan Riley, City University. I think my questions are simply, first of all, in relation to the Russian gas supply. The International Energy Agency last year in the World Energy Outlook was talking about the Russian gas market having to replace 90% of production by 2035, so 635 billion cubic meters, replace something that the order of magnitude in terms of investment is $730 billion in 2010 dollars. Now, one of the questions is can Russia actually supply that gas, especially given its kind of high north strategy? Is there cheaper gas available? Actually, should Russia go for shale gas, which might be cheaper itself? And the other kind of bigger question, which affects Gazprom and, in fact, all of the gas suppliers, is this. One of the questions which is not debated is not so much the impact of cheap LNG being dumped in Europe or in Asia, but the effect of the shutting off of the coal markets in the United States because of cheap gas, and the coal being dumped in Europe and other parts of the world. And the danger is if you start getting a lot of shale gas developed in the rest of the world, they will look for markets to dump the coal. And ironically, rather than Europe leading the world into renewables, the actual future for Europe may well be as the dumping ground for coal. And this will affect principally the European gas suppliers like Gazprom.
I think we need to sort of cut it off there.
And that's my point is the coal, the issue for Gazprom in part is about its gas and its ability to actually deliver the investment in an area of high corruption and low investor protection. And then on another side is the threat it faces from coal.
I think we really have to take an answer, sir. Thank you very much.
I think I partially answered your question when I talked about the role of independent gas producers and I talked about the role of Rosneft. One of the reasons for the current re-emergence of Rosneft, so to speak, is that Rosneft potentially, together with international oil companies, could, as I said, displace Gazprom's role. So I think just focusing on Gazprom is not really entirely accurate. I think you should look at when we're talking about these issues, we need to look at what the independent producers can do and can deliver. And again, which volumes we're talking about, how much, for Russia at the moment, I think the key dilemma is to retain its role in European markets, potentially maybe increase it slightly.
And sorry, I'm really going to bring you to a close, but did you take the coal point seriously as a sort of serious, sort of unforeseen consequence, as the gentleman suggested?
Not really, no. I think it's...
But you two can sort that one out afterwards then. Thank you very much indeed, Shamil.
Thank you.
Right, well, now we're going to bring it home and back to the UK for the final part. So do stick with us for the last part of the debate. And I'm going to welcome to the stage with me Dr. Pierre Noël, who is Senior Research Associate and Director of Energy Policy Forum at the University of Cambridge, specialising in oil and gas markets and industry, and David Howe, Lord Howe, who's an advisor to the Foreign Secretary on energy security and a former Minister of State at the Foreign Office with responsibility for international energy issues. We'd like to try and draw together a bit of what we've heard tonight before the final round of questions. David, Lord Howe, from what you've heard tonight, do you see a major shift in the role of gas and the questions about gas?
Well, I think a lot of it is happened already. I mean, the major shift has happened in America. The entire world's gas or energy mix is being altered while we're sitting here. All sorts of countries, particularly either side of Africa, which I'm very, very concerned with, Tanzania, Mozambique, Kenya, and on the other side, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Nigeria itself, are all seeing fantastically changed prospects now, as it turns out that they have got commercially recoverable shale gas and shale oil, tight oil as well, offshore and onshore, which is going to transform their prospects and their politics as well. So there's a huge change going on now. And the question for the politicians and the policymakers is how this is managed in a sensible way, consistent with what is generally agreed in all parties and in government in this country, that we must move towards the low-carbon green age, that we must do it in a sensible way, that we mustn't let the politics screw up the ambitions and the ideals, And that is the really tricky area. This is almost entirely to do, this debate, with communication with people and carrying democratic political societies in a way that will make the aims of low carbon consistent with economic recovery now and a reasonable carrying of burdens, but not an unreasonable carrying of burdens. So that's where we are now.
Pierre, what questions did the debate throw up for you tonight, or observations about the concerns?
Well, you know, I think there's a bit of a reality check to be done. Currently in Europe, all over Europe, gas is displaced. Gas consumption is going down everywhere in all sectors of the economy. If we want more gas to be consumed, we can. I mean, there's plenty of it on the market. But in Europe, gas is squeezed between renewables that are very heavily subsidized on the one hand, and coal, which is absurdly cheap on the other hand. We have, so, and gas is squeezed between the two. So one way out, which would be sensible in terms of climate change, is to have a carbon price that's a bit more reasonable, which by which I would be a bit higher,
High, yeah.
which would at the very least restore the competitiveness of gas against coal. But the way we subsidize renewables actually depresses the carbon price in Europe. So we have a set of completely inconsistent policies that give us the worst of all worlds, which is the high cost of renewables and the high emissions of coal.
How do you occasionally express some frustration with the green agenda? You put it rather politely, saying all parties, should work towards carrying a reasonable burden, but sometimes you have suggested that this burden may be actually rather unreasonable.
Well, what I'm really saying, and this doesn't sound too paradoxical, is that the green agenda, if pressed incompetently in political terms with the wrong compelling messages imposed on people in the wrong ways, will actually delay the green revolution. And we've just had a perfect example here that people are saying, oh, we must be very careful about gas expansion, and we don't, shale gas in America's fine, but we don't want to see too much encouragement here. What is the net effect of that? The net effect is that American coal is pouring into Europe. We're burning more coal here in this country. Europe's coal as a whole is increasing. And Germans are planning new coal-fired stations. And CO2, while falling to America to the 20-year lowest level, and has fallen 14% in the last 2 years, and the per capita emissions has fallen dramatically. So it's not just a recession issue.
Well, I did want to challenge you on that, because you have chosen quite a 2-year horizon in a time of low US growth. Yes. Can I call you on that?
Well, you can call me, but there are 57 million extra people in America in the last 20 years, and yet the CO2 emissions are now 20% down. They are very low now compared to... Anyway, here's the zealotry of over-eager. I'm as green as the next. I want to see a low-carbon, high-efficiency, low energy density economy. But if you press this too far and get the politics wrong, what do? You create more pure poverty, which is what we're happening now with very high gas prices, although we haven't got to this. It would get worse with high if they're maintained. You apparently generate far from less CO2, you generate more. You damage competitiveness of industry. You obviously weaken the growth of jobs and delay the recovery. This seems a very, very expensive advance, a very expensive procedure in order to rush through too fast the green revolution. It's a question of pace and communication. That's what it is. It's pace, communication, and politics.
No, just comment on that if you'd like to.
And what was the question again?
The question is, I suppose, one, do you see it the same way that David sees it, or indeed, if you want to outline something of your own set of solutions, please do that.
I think there's what's happening in the UK is very interesting, because you have a situation that's politically very difficult for the government. It would be as difficult if it was the Labour Party running the country, it's not a question of parties, it's a question of the country has committed to some targets that, guess what, are very expensive to reach. And politicians have spent the better part of the past decade telling people, don't worry, it's going to be very cheap. We're going to go green and we're going to save money at the same time. It's going to be great. And now the invoices are starting to come. And it's only the very beginning. We've barely scratched the surface. So I have basically two messages. The first one is, whatever we do on climate change, we have to do it cost effectively. We have to start with the cheapest carbon emission reductions that we can get. Currently, we're starting with the most expensive ones. Offshore winds is a typical example. Solar panels is another typical. I mean, the cost of them is falling quite quickly, we have to be honest, but still very, very high. That's the first message. Do it cost effectively. The only way that I know about to do that is simply to tax carbon, right? At the highest level that the political process will allow, which may not be very, very high, but hopefully will be higher than what we currently have. The second message is, let's be very honest about the long-term objectives. If we don't have a meaningful global agreement that will map a way to share the burden of addressing this global problem, there will not be any low-carbon system in any country. There will be a lower carbon system.
That's proved elusive.
Compared to what we have.
Well, because we won't get a global, agreed, legally binding system. We've tried that. The Chinese are not going to touch that. The Russians are not going to touch it. The Americans are not going to touch it.
The problem is we trade with all those people.
That is the fantasy world. But we will get lower carbon on a substantial scale. America is enjoying it now because, at least partly, of the shale gas revolution, the switch from coal to gas, which is massive. China is actually, although their emissions are very, very high and they're the great emitter, they are applying all kinds of new energy technologies. They're brilliant at solar, reducing the cost of solar, so that it may come within reach.
Right.
So this is really, the talk about global targets, you see, is the wrong approach, I'm afraid. I think the right approach is technology. We have to apply the technologies to get the cost of CCS down, to get the solar way, way down. It can be reduced by 9/10 over the next few years. If we really concentrate on technology and government support for the technology, for green technologies, we will make progress. If we go on about targets and taxes, we won't. We'll just get political reaction and we'll go backwards, as we are doing now.
Let's get a reaction from Pierre.
I entirely agree that spending money on R&D is key to any serious energy and climate policy. R&D spending on energy has gone down 80% in 30 years. So, you know, this just gives you a bit of a reality check.
That's where the money should go.
China and green energy.
Subsidizing wind farms.
China and green energy is my favorite one. I've got a spreadsheet in my computer where I track year after year the percentage of the growth in Chinese energy, primary energy consumption, that's covered by coal. And it used to be 98%, and now it's 78%. You know? And it's going down very slowly. So, you know, yes, I mean they manufacture solar panels that they send to Germany because the German consumers is apparently very willing to pay to transfer subsidies to China. This will stop before we start doing it in the UK.
But you see, this brings us back to shale gas. Mr. Liu Turnin, the Chinese energy minister, told me the other day in Brussels that China had a 5-year plan for shale gas, that they had more shale gas than America if they could get to it. He admitted the geological problems, which some other Chinaman said that is Chinese for saying some of these shale gas deposits are under cities, a little awkward. But they have got, if they move that way to shale gas, they will achieve more in terms of reducing the growth of carbon emissions than anything else, than all these other fancy global
reducing the growth.
I mean, whose side are we on?
Reducing the growth, yes.
I'm on the side of
that
the
is not going to give you 450 ppm.
We are
reducing the
moving
growth,
towards
yeah.
the end now, so I would love to bring anyone in who just feels that they've got to ask. If you could make the short, pointed questions, would be very appreciated. The gentleman in the blue shirt, and then, oh gosh, so many hands. The lady in the black top, and we'll see how far we get. Do we have a microphone? Hello, Houston? Anyone who puts a hand up and gets a microphone can go first, as far as I'm concerned. Go to the lady in the black top. And if you could keep them really short and also your answers concise.
Thank you very much. My name is Natasha Mounier. I work in the investment side. And I'm curious on your views about the taxation of carbon. The current system of carbon permits is really dysfunctional. It costs very little. It's about 7 or 8 euros a ton. And yet, if that were to go up, our energy bill would go up too, because it's clearly passed on to the consumers. So it really creates a conundrum. I'm not sure what's best in terms of carbon reduction and what's best for the consumers and the politicians who we vote for.
Hold that thought. We'll take a question over here. Yes. Do we have a microphone over here?
Yes.
Thank you.
Benny Peiser from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. I don't know whether you've seen the recent debate between President Obama and Romney. But basically they were vying who would get more oil and coal and gas out of the ground. Climate change didn't feature, but they try to portray themselves as people who would even get more out of the ground. So I think we need a little bit of a reality check. Climate change is dead. Internationally, even in Europe, countries are rolling back the policies. And it's obvious that the countries in the next 20, 30 years that have the cheapest form of energy will be the successful countries, and the countries with the most expensive form of energies will go down the drain. That's the reality, and I wonder whether the penny is beginning to drop in this country.
Yes, but the cheapest form of energy will come from those with the cleverest technology and the greatest efficient use of energy. That's where I come back to the technology point. I mean, I don't quite agree, Benny, that the climate debate is dead. There are a lot of people who are rightly concerned that we could be heading for great climate violence of an increasing kind and leading vast suffering to numbers of people. So that is not the dead. There was the exchange between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama was quite amusing, because Mitt Romney said to Barack, "You're not an oil man." And Barack Obama said, "Well, you're not a gas man." So it's a question of technology. The fear I have is that the overzealotry, the people saying, no, let's push up the prices, let's have carbon permits so poised that carbon becomes cripplingly expensive and a disincentive to all gas and everything. Those who say, never mind about the consumers, never mind about fuel poverty, never mind about industry, let's pile on the costs so that we get a minimum subsidy for renewables. Those people are going to wreck the whole program, frankly. They're going to destroy the green program.
Sorry, David, but could I just, Pierre, could you possibly take on a bit of the first question on pricing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the problem we have is that the damage we cause to the global environment is not reflected in the price of the energy we consume, right? That's the most basic definition of the problem we have. If you bring even partly the cost, what we call the external cost of your fossil fuel consumption into the price of energy, you raise, the price is a bit higher or much higher if you do it meaningfully. There's no way around that. Yes, addressing climate change is all about changing the relative prices of energy to make the carbon-intensive ones relatively more expensive and the carbon less intensive one relatively less expensive.
Actually, it's all about what the public will believe and what they will take in the way of messages.
The public can believe whatever they want. The ton of CO2 in a ton of coal will not change.
In a democracy, it actually matters.
Well, indeed, that wasn't the point that we heard earlier. It was Mike Stevenson who pointed out that it was a real problem what the public believed.
Well, and what he conveyed, and the power of those who have got authority and the eloquence in order to convey the right message. The saving the world message of Al Gore is absolutely hopeless. It is not convincing anybody at all.
You know what? I thought you probably wouldn't agree with Al Gore. So let's just try a couple of really quick questions towards the end, and then you gentlemen can sum up. There were some hands at the back. Have they? Yes, there's a gentleman here. Yes, please introduce yourself.
I wanted to just come back to...
Could you just introduce yourself?
Sorry, Alan Riley, City University. I was going to ask Pierre about the issue about China. I mean, I've talked to some of the Chinese, and when they talk about the scale of the resource base in China for shale gas, they say, yes, there are difficulties, but the potential in terms of their own energy security, the potential in terms of reducing not just the CO2 issues, but the general terrible levels of pollution from coal in Chinese city. The incentives are so great that the idea of having the plan, which is I think 6.5 billion cubic meters by 2015, 100 billion cubic meters by 2020, and then looking at something to 600 to 800 billion cubic meters by 2030, they see that as potentially achievable. Now, if they do that, surely you are talking about something which is a real blunting of climate change, because at the end of the day, they're the sharp end of the CO2 emissions.
Okay, and we have heard from you before, so let's have someone we haven't heard from before. The gentleman in the middle with the glasses, could you possibly get the mic in here, please, in the middle?
Thanks. My name's Archie Fraser. I'm an alternative energy analyst in the city. The speakers have made a couple of points about the fall in the cost of solar energy and the potential future fall, but I wonder if they're really aware of the scale of what has happened in solar energy. I'd just like to chuck 3 facts at them. Firstly, the cost of a solar module has fallen 80% in the last 4 years, from about €3 a watt to about 60 cents. That's just a question of fact. Secondly, the amount that you can be paid in Germany for a rooftop system under the feed-in tariff is now well below what you actually pay for retail electricity. So if you choose to buy electricity, you will pay about 10% more than the government will pay you for your rooftop system, which shows pretty clearly that the system is competitive at below the level of retail cost. And thirdly, I'd just like to point out that several gigawatts of ground-mounted solar systems are currently in development in Spain. Developers are putting in tens, hundreds of millions of cost in developing several gigawatts of projects which are not expected or intended to receive any subsidy at all.
Right, so we've got one China question. Hang on. Your solar three-pointer. No more three-pointers, but if anyone's got one really, go on. There's a lady up here who's got her hand nice and high, and it looks like she's got a very brief and pointed question.
My name's Nicola Park. I work in industrial gas rather than the natural gas and energy field, but I'm also a STEM ambassador, and we talk a lot about technology is going to be the source. I've been to a school today, and lots of these kids are not interested in STEM subjects, but we need them to come forward in order to bring these technologies so that we can solve this problem. What do you think we should be doing about that?
Right, would you like to take those, Stephen?
So I didn't quite get the last one.
Well, so it was really about your question was how to get interest across in the new technologies. Yeah. But actually it was an interesting question because it's come through tonight, a bit of frustration that we don't win over public support and public opinion. There's no...
I think there's an enormous
Where
amount,
are we going
just starting at the end, there's an enormous amount to be done in schools about the excitement and possibilities of the new technologies, but they've got to get the cost down. What is naughty in the political world is pretending, as I think someone said earlier in the debate, that we can get to this renewable, green, low-carbon world with less problems of Middle East oil, less problems of digging up the earth and so on, and can do it in a way that is all very easy and won't cost a lot of suffering and difficulty. It can be done, but it's got to be done very slowly and carefully. And it is the misleading idea that we can jump to the low-carbon economy without pain.
We have said that. I think you should move on and talk. Just briefly give a reply on solar, if you could.
I can give you a very... What you're saying is largely correct, and indeed I alluded to it earlier, except I think it's fallen by 9 times, not 8 times in the last 5 years. The solar prospects are great. The Chinese have got way ahead in the technology. It is a very big hope for all the villages in desert and poorer areas around the world. 1.25 billion people haven't got electricity at all. Can they get onto huge grids? Very difficult. A much cheaper and possibly a more exciting way is really efficient, low-cost PVCs for low-cost solar development. It's full of potential, it's very exciting, but it all comes down to cost, and the Chinese are leading the way on that, and well done them.
Let's have Pierre then.
No, well, the cost of solar is going down. I mean, fantastic. It's I mean, again, if the cost of clean heat and electricity doesn't fall down dramatically, we're not going to solve this problem, right? Because we're never going to impose on ourselves the types of carbon prices we would need to address it meaningfully, right? So the cost of solar has gone down, fantastic. The bill has been extremely high for those who have actually pump primed this market. Just last year, the total amount of green energy, of renewable energy subsidies in Germany was 17 billion euro a year. It's going to be nearly 20% more than that this year, and it's for 25 years, right? 17 billion euros a year. Just to give you a point of comparison, Abu Dhabi bought 6 gigawatts of nuclear power from the South Koreans for 5.6 billion euros. And that's dispatchable zero carbon power. So the Germans have paid for bringing down the cost of solar, not by actually improving the technology at all, just bringing the Chinese in.
That's right.
And now they're asking the rest of us, France, the UK, to support them in an antitrust case against China. I mean, you know.
That's right.
You mentioned Spain. Okay, so now that the cost has gone down, perhaps they need less subsidies or maybe no subsidies at all, which is great. And I agree with you. But the past 10 years, the government in Spain has refused for the cost of renewables to be reflected in the tariff. So what they did is they created this huge debt, which, guess what? They securitized.
Yeah.
So they created a new junk bond, which is implicitly guaranteed by the Germans because it's in the Eurozone, that you can buy if you want to. You're in the city, you can buy it.
Well, what could possibly go wrong? You see, we give you top tips.
I think it's a nice...
These are all the problems. You're correct. These are all the problems if you go the wrong way, which we've been going in many areas of attempting to subsidize renewables. The future, if we want to get CO2 down, it's got to be step by step. It's got to be politically practical. It's got to be based on gas now and technology later. That's all we need. That's all we need. Gas and technology.
Last thought from you, Pierre.
So
not everything else is a byway.
You've said time and again, it's all about technology. The cost has to go down. It's not going down magically. It's going down if you throw money at it. Lots of money at it. Who pays for that? The cost of technology is not going to go down like that. So we cannot go around the problem. This is a serious policy problem because it's very expensive.
Chinese technology is bringing down the price. And there are many other areas where we can get the price down. I agree, it needs government support, that's absolutely right. But it's much better spending money that way than subsidizing useless wind farms and offshore farms, which are wildly expensive.
But this is subsidized.
10 seconds to finish your point. Come on, because we all need to go and have some dinner.
It is very heavy German subsidies for solar that brought the Chinese in and the prices down. It's not magic.
It's technology.
It's not magic at all, but I do hope that we have generated at least a bit of light as well as rather a lot of heat, particularly at the end of our debate tonight. Look, thanks to all our speakers and, of course, to Intelligence Squared and Shell for hosting this event, which I've certainly enjoyed very much and hope you have. We would be very grateful if you could fill in the feedback forms, which are on your chairs or probably under your chairs by now if you got agitated, and kick them out of the way. And thank you all so much for coming. Safe journey home.